Welcome to today's Constitution at Work podcast. Today we'll be looking at the Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill, which is now making its way through Parliament. A few weeks ago, the F.W. de Klerk Foundation made a submission to Parliament on some of the elements of this legislation that we are worried about. Tyla is the head of our constitutional program at the F.W. de Klerk Foundation. I'm going to ask her why we should be worried about the BELA Bill, as it is called.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you to everyone joining us. So the Foundation made submissions on the BELA Bill because the point of departure in South African law is Section 29 of the Constitution, which states that everyone has the right to basic education. We felt that the BELA Bill, although it was intending to promote this section, fell short in that it actually infringed on Section 6, your right to language, Section 29's right to education, Section 30, the right to the culture of your choosing, and then Section 31, the right to association. And the reasons for this will go in for a bit more detail later. The basic summary of the submission made by the Foundation was that the bill's intention to take power from school governing bodies and instead confer it to department heads would in effect curtail the rights of learners to education in a language of their choosing, and to the parents of schools having actual tangible say in the education their children would get, as well as the governing of the schools. Of course, we know that the law says that the school governing bodies are the appropriate vessel for admissions and language policies to channel through, but instead this would move it to Department of State and would have very little influence from what's happening on the ground in the schools. So that was a major concern for us. The second major concern for the Foundation was the Section 1 definition of required documents that the BELA Bill would impose. This requirement would go against case law on the same matter and against the current domestic laws that we have, in that it would require specific documents from learners and bar their access to basic education if they fail to produce it, and in some instances actually lead to criminal fines or imprisonment for parents who failed to give these documents forward.
Okay, so we're concerned really about this whole question of the school governing bodies having the right to determine language policy and admissions policy, and then all of this extra bureaucratic burden on parents. Now, I'm sure that the ANC government would say, look, we are just trying to do the best with the resources we have at our disposal. We have a huge shortage of classrooms and schools, and we see some schools, the so-called Model C schools, particularly single language schools teaching Afrikaans, they're not fully used. So our view is that we should make sure that every school is properly used, and if this means that there's space in an Afrikaans language school for kids who don't speak Afrikaans, then that school must introduce English as a second language of tuition. Now, what's wrong with that idea?
So I mean, coming out of a roundtable discussion with the Gauteng MEC for Basic Education, Panyaza Lesufi, the intention of the bill and the intention of the state is to actually create multilingual schools where 3 languages are on offer, so that attendees can be taught in their mother tongue language. But unfortunately, this idealistic view is not what we're seeing on the ground. It's not a feasible option given the lack of resources with the state. And what it actually has seen to do when we introduce the dominant language of English, as we've seen with the implementation of language policies in our tertiary education universities, is that it tends to erode the minority indigenous language. In this case, it would be Afrikaans. I think that the focus for the foundation is not on creating new bills that tailor different processes. It's instead implementing processes we already have. We have the Official Languages Act. Why aren't we implementing that properly? Why aren't we getting the state to encourage Indigenous languages more through provision of resources to schools that want to teach in isiXhosa or Zulu or whatever the case may be, instead of providing dual language at schools that are already well resourced and coping and have a good admissions and language policy. We should instead be looking at how we can promote that throughout the country.
So the Afrikaans speaking community is worried about this bill because it could mean the death knell for Afrikaans medium education. What you're referring to is Lepanse's law. He was an educationist who determined some time ago that as soon as you have a world language and a regional language in the same educational institution, the world language quickly drives out the regional language. But if this were to happen in South Africa, it would start to change the multicultural and multilingual nature of the society that is actually protected in the Constitution. And the other element is that it has been established time and time again that you need to have the first 6 or 7 years of your education in a language that you understand. And at the moment, this is not the case, particularly for kids in Black schools in South Africa. They have a mother tongue sometimes for the first 3 years, then they switch in primary school already to English, but it's a language that they don't hear at home, and it's a language which many of the teachers don't speak. And the result of that is that the children concerned are at an enormous disadvantage throughout their education career. They finally have to write matric in English, and they don't really, many of them don't have a sufficient grasp of English to be able to succeed. So this is manifestly unfair, not only to Afrikaans kids who want to learn in their own language, but to all of those indigenous speaking South Africans who also have an equal right to education. And that right is protected in section 29(2) of the Constitution, which says quite clearly that everyone is entitled to education in the language of their choice at public educational institutions where this is practicable. So what's happening here? Tyla, what do you think? Does the government have an ulterior motive? And if so, what is that motive?
I think there's been a lot of talk of a motive to almost vilify Afrikaans and to remove Afrikaans completely from the syllabus. And I think that it's quite blatant in this bill that instead of the state using this as an opportunity to promote Indigenous languages, it definitely will lead, exactly like you say, to an erosion of Indigenous languages in this country. And of course, it will erode the right in Section 6 of the Constitution. But further than that, as you accurately say, mother tongue language should be promoted, especially in the first years of education. And I think that all that this will point to do is to allow English to dominate across South Africa and almost make Section 6 redundant, in my opinion.
So this is something that we should be worried about. And it also seems to some observers that what the ANC is trying to do here is to impose demographic representativity throughout society, in schools, in sport, in the public service, in the private sector. The idea is that in all classrooms, in all schools, the composition of the students and the teachers should reflect the demographic relations or proportions in the country as a whole. Is this unfair? Isn't this justice that there should be, if there are 8% of the population are whites, that they should be 8% in each class and there should be 8% of the teachers and so forth. Isn't that a just formula for an effective multiracial society?
So I think demographic representativity is not going to allow us to get our economy and our country to the level it needs to. I think it does little to, in this case, promote basic education, because it fails to take into account the resources that would be required in order to promote Indigenous languages, specifically to a sector of a population based on demographics. I think that until we are able to confidently say that every single person or every single child is getting a quality of education, we can't even begin to look at where demographic representativity would take us. Latest stats tell us that 80% of our public schools are dysfunctional. We came 75 out of 76 in a 2020 survey on quality of education globally. South Africa placed 75 out of 76. So I think that our issue, especially in light of the BELA Bill, is to provide quality education, basic education to the public, and to make sure that our schools have the resources to offer the curriculum they currently have in the language that they currently have, before we start looking at how we are going to increase dual medium schools or how we are going to bring in demographic representativity. I think that there are a lot of steps before we can get to that point.
Yeah, but it's not only language, is it, that the amendment bill is going to affect? It also affects the school governing body's ability to determine admission policy. And some people see this as a threat to Model C schools.
Yes.
Model C schools are big part of the 20% of schools that actually still offer decent education to South African kids. Most of them have integrated very successfully. Most of them are performing well, but they do not yet represent the demographics of the country. And there's a feeling that there's almost an ideological requirement now to move into a situation where even these schools will represent the population of South Africa. But what would the implications be for these still remaining excellent schools? We're very worried that they might not survive. What do you think? And do you know what the parents are thinking about this?
So there's definitely a lot of confusion on how this bill will impact Model C schools. And there are a lot of parents concerned for how that will impact their rights as guardians of children to decide on the language, to decide on the culture. I mean, our white paper on education that all our education laws were initially based on speak about the parents having the ability to decide on the best education for their children, of course, within the parameters of the Constitution. And this includes language, this includes cultural education. So it is definitely alarming that there's almost this blanket rule wanting to be imposed to all schools or public schools that would see a dramatic shift in what we have seen currently, from school governing powers to the language policies that are implemented. And I think that it definitely does jeopardize Model C schools going forward.
So Tyla, what we're talking about here then, just to sum up, is legislation that might have a almost catastrophic impact on the notion of South Africa as a multicultural, multilingual nature. It is legislation that appears to many to have deep ideological roots. And it is education that would threaten some of our continuing best public schools. What can we do about it? What can ordinary South African parents and citizens do about this legislation?
So I think the best thing for every single person to do is to become very active, to become active citizens. Currently, this bill is sitting with the National Assembly. That's why this public comment period was called, which ended on the 15th of August. It still needs to go through the National Council of Provinces, which will allow another opportunity for public comment. And I think that that's really what needs to happen, from schools to school governing bodies to individuals to any organization that really has any type of interest in this matter. They need to get very vocal, and they need to start saying what they want to see in their schools.
Thank you, Tyla. This has been Constitution at Work. Please follow our podcasts. Join us for our next podcast, which will be coming quite soon.
Thank you.